Hi, Grandma here reading Ben and Me by Robert Lawson, although it theoretically is written by Amos the Mouse. In the last chapter, we found out about the terrific experiment that Ben Franklin had where he almost electrocuted the governor of Pennsylvania. It was by accident. Amos fiddled with the wires and it was a lot more electricity going through them than they had thought. We're going to be talking more about electricity for the next two chapters. Chapter 7, the lightning rod. And here you can see a picture of Ben Franklin on the roof with all kinds of iron rods sticking on the roof where he's trying to attract electricity. Now, when you attract electricity, you have a chance of burning your house down. But the lightning rod that he ultimately invented prevents that from happening. It attracts the lightning, but it takes the electricity safely to the ground without hurting your house. After the electrical exhibition, most of Ben's acquaintances regarded him rather suspiciously. The governor even crossed to the opposite side of the street when we approached. Ben never noticed, though, being wrapped up in more experiments. I observed that he was developing an unseemly interest in lightning. Every time a house or a tree was struck, Ben was the first to reach the scene, questioning all who had been present as to how the bolt had looked, smelled, or sounded, what sensations they had felt, and so on. Then he would go into a brown study that lasted for hours, occasionally murmuring, "I wonder, I wonder." "Wonder what?" I asked finally. It was getting on my nerves. "Why, if lightning and electricity are the same thing." "Well, to me they are," I said promptly. "They're both annoying, horrid, dangerous nuisances that should be strictly alone." "There you go again, Amos. No vision, no vision." "All right," I said, "all right. And if they are the same, and if you do prove it, then what?" "Why then," he said, "why then I shall go down in history as he who tamed the lightning, who, if you have any notion of making a house pet of this lightning," I said, "you can go down in history as anything you please. For myself, I will go down to the cellar and stay there." 10 days later, I was waked from my afternoon nap by a terrible clatter overhead. Investigation disclosed Ben seated on the roof, busy hammering. He'd fastened a whole collection of sharp-pointed iron rods to various parts of the housetop. There were 2 or 3 on each chimney and a series of them along the ridgepole. These were all connected by a tangle of wires and rods that ran down through the trapdoor into our room. "You see, Amos," he explained while connecting wires to various instruments, "the trouble with most people is that they lack the calm observation of the trained scientific mind. Time after time, I've rushed to the scene of one of the lightning strokes, and all I could gather from the bystanders was that they were, quote, terribly scared, unquote. Now, by collecting a small amount of this so-called lightning with the rods which you saw on the roof and conducting it through wires to these jars and instruments, we shall be able to investigate its nature and behavior with true scientific calm. We shall be able to settle forever the question which is puzzling all great minds, the question of whether or not lightning is electrical." "It's never puzzled my mind," I said. "Left to myself, I wouldn't give it a thought." "Moreover," I continued, "you might as well leave out that 'we.' I resigned from these experiments a long time ago. Any observation that I do will be done in the cellar. And as the sky has clouded up rather threateningly, I think I will retire there at once." The storm must have been closer than I thought, for I had barely started for the door when there occurred a most horrifying flash of lightning, followed by a thunderclap that shook the house to its foundations. The shock threw me bodily into a large glass jar, luckily empty. This was really fortunate, for here I was able to observe all that went on. while the glass seemed to protect me from the lightning flashes that now followed one another with rapid succession. At the first flash, the liquid in Ben's jars disappeared in a great burst of yellowish stream, and the instruments bounced about wildly. As flash followed flash, blue sparks ran up and down the wires. The brass andirons glowed as though dipped in phosphorus, and streaks of fire shot from the candlesticks on the mantelpiece. The crashing thunder was, of course, continuous, jarring every loose object in the house. There was now no doubt in my mind that lightning was electricity in its most horrid and dangerous form. In the confusion, I'd forgotten Ben. Now looking about, I was astonished to find him nowhere in sight. At the moment, a large ball of blue fire emerged from the Franklin stove, rolled across the floor, descended the stairs, crackling and giving off a strange odor of sulfur. The unusually violent crash that followed brought a faint moan from the bed. There I discovered Ben, or rather his feet, for they were the only part of him visible. The rest was covered by bedclothes, while 2 pillows completely muffled his head. At first I was alarmed, but as each succeeding crash brought an echoing moan and a violent trembling of the feet, I realized that all that had befallen him was a severe case of fright. Safe in my glass jar, I thoroughly enjoyed the spectacle of Ben's terror as long as the storm raged. And we have a picture of Ben in his bed with blankets, and over here in a glass jar is Amos. As the last rumblings died away, he cautiously raised the pillows and peered forth. It was a most amusing sight. "And now, Dr. Franklin," I jeered as he sheepishly rose from the bed, "would you lend a bit of your calm scientific study to getting me out of this jar? And by the way, what did you observe as to the true nature of lightning?" "Do you know, Amos," he explained, "that first flash knocked off my glasses, and of course I see very poorly without them." "So you replaced them with a couple of pillows?" I said. He never answered me. He just started picking up the remains of his apparatus. When sometime later a scientific writer called them lightning rods, naming Ben as their inventor, he refused to take the credit. This startling display of modesty surprised many people, but not me. I knew all about it. In other words, it was not an exciting discovery for him. It was more fear. That kite. Now, this is the story that we all have heard about Benjamin Franklin discovering electricity with the kite. But let's hear Amos tell the story. After the disastrous lightning rod experiment, Ben was quite subdued for some days and never even mentioned electricity. I hoped that he was cured of this dangerous hobby, but alas, my hope was soon to be rudely shattered. The question of the nature of lightning so preyed upon his mind that he was finally driven to an act of deceit that caused the first and only rift in our long friendship. I feel sure that brooding on this subject must have seriously affected his mind, for this is the only way in which I can excuse his treacherous conduct. Well, I'm very curious as to what he's done. It came about in this fashion. One of Ben's favorite forms of relaxation was kite flying. On his largest kite, he'd built for me a tiny platform made of light splinters of wood. This was securely lashed to the kite just where the sticks of the frame crossed. A stout railing surrounded it, and the floor was cushioned with milkweed down so that a safer and more snug retreat could scarcely be imagined. Sailing aloft in this was a delightful sensation. The gentle motions of the kite, the warmth of the sun, the broad view spread out below, all combined to make it a thoroughly restful and enjoyable experience. Well, I wonder what happened that it no longer was. A new thrill was added when we contrived a tiny car slung to a pulley running on the kite string. In this, I could cast off from my little porch and go coasting in a long, glorious swoop to Ben and the earth below. Here we have a picture of him. Some of you may have ridden in pulleys like this, but not on a kite string, probably on some kind of a wire. To this car, we later added a small sail so that when the wind was sufficiently strong, I could sail up the string to the kite. Enabled thus to ascend and descend at will, I spent many happy hours at this thrilling sport. That deceit could raise its ugly head in such idyllic surroundings and bring to an end this innocent diversions seemed particularly painful. I shall pass over as rapidly as possible the unfortunate happenings which almost brought our friendship to a close. Ben had hinted that if I were willing to stay aloft during a thunderstorm, I could, being so close to the clouds, very easily determine the nature of lightning. My reply to this proposal was prompt, decided, and in the negative. Very strongly in the negative. So much so that Ben dropped the subject and had, I thought, given up the idea completely. But alas, for my trust in human honor, little did I dream of the horrid place that this electrical mania was causing to form in his disordered brain. One hot July afternoon, I had ridden aloft and, lulled by the gentle motion and the sun's warmth, had indulged in a long nap. From this, I was awakened by a violent tossing of the kite. I at once realized from the black and threatening clouds that a sudden thunderstorm was rapidly approaching, its preliminary gusts already tossing the kite wildly about. Hastily preparing to descend to my little car, I was horrified to discover that it was not there. Jerks on the string to signal Ben, bringing no response. The ugly details of his plot began to dawn on me. I recalled his haste to launch the kite and his incessant talk while doing so, all designed to hide the fact that he had removed the car. With or without my consent, he had resolved to keep me aloft during the storm. And we have a horrifying picture here. Look at the mouse's face, poor Amos. Up in that basket, no cart to sail down. I sought wildly for some method of descending the string, but the wind by now was so strong that all my efforts were required to cling to the frail platform. The next half hour was the most awful experience of my life. The wild plunging of the kite, the driving sheets of rain, the incessant lightning flashes, and the crashing thunder all were so terrifying that I could only hang on and pray. As shock after stiffening shock ran through my body, there was no further doubt in my mind as to the nature of lightning. It was electrical, decidedly so. Blue sparks crackled from my whiskers, every hair stood on end, and my frame was convulsed by the never-ending shocks. After what seemed hours of this torture, the storm passed, and I knew by the motion of the string that the kite was being lowered. Nearer the earth, I saw that Ben had taken cover in a shed and was regarding my approach with the greatest eagerness. Before I reached the ground, he was calling, "Was it, Amos? Was it electricity? Was it?" Even had rage not rendered me speechless, I should never have given him the satisfaction of an answer. As the kite touched earth, I descended and stalked past him in stony silence. Despite his questions and pleadings, I pursued my angry way back to the town, never pausing until I'd reached the shelter of the vestry. There, after my wondering family had dried me and dressed my burns, I fell into exhausted sleep that lasted 2 days. I woke from this long slumber, thoroughly recovered in body, if not in mind, to hear the familiar booming of Ben's voice. I found him seated in the vestry where my mother, flustered by this visit of the family's generous patron, was making a great to-do over him. My greeting was cold, but Ben was most agreeable and apologetic. He'd brought with him our agreement, which he felt I had broken by leaving him. "A mere scrap of paper," I snorted, and went on to point out that his electrical craze had not existed when our agreement was signed, that it alone had caused all our differences and had made life a burden for me. In fact, I pointed out things for almost an hour. "Never," I declared, "never while this madness lasts will I return to our former association." Ben finally gave in and agreed to stop all electrical experimenting forever. He wrote it into the agreement, we signed it, shook hands on the bargain. With goodwill restored, my beaming parents brought in a few refreshments and we had a jolly visit. The children were presented to Ben, who was most gracious to them all, patting their heads, asking questions about their schooling and pastimes. Luckily, none of them mentioned kite flying. "Amos," he said at length, "the reason that I gave up my scientific investigations so readily is this. As you doubtless know, relations between these American colonies and our mother country, England, had become very badly strained. So much so that I have been chosen to go to England and lay our case before the King and Parliament to attempt to make clear to them the justice of our grievances, to avoid the dangers of a rebellion and possibly of war. Without you, Amos, I should be lost. Your advice and your wonderful facility for gathering information are more than ever necessary to me. Here is a great opportunity to prove your devotion to your country and to the sacred cause of liberty. What say you, Amos? I sail at dawn." It was a solemn moment, but without an instant's hesitation, I sprang to my feet. "I'm with you, Ben. Besides, I understand that the English cheeses are of excellent quality." In the cold gray damp of the early morning, I was at the dock, where our ship lay in readiness to sail. Suddenly, I noticed a long line of shipwrecks filing ashore, laden with their belongings. Well, here is an unlucky sign, I thought, and hastened to ask the reason for their desertion. One of the rats, an old gray-bearded fellow, pointed glumly to the top of the masts. "Them," he said. Peering aloft, I made out, fastened to the top of each mast, one of those hated iron rods. "Lightning rods," I muttered. "That's what he calls them," growled the old graybeard. "Down here all day he was putting them up. Convinced the captain that protecting the ship from lightning. I don't hold with no such newfangled notions. I don't. I'm through." At that moment, Ben came puffing down the dock, laden with bags, late as usual. "Ben," I demanded, pointing to the mast tops, "what are those?" "Why, those, Amos, why, those are just, oh, never mind, just hurry about like a good fellow. I'll explain those later." "Explain them to the sharks," I said, turning on my heel. "But Amos," he protested as the soldiers hurried him up the gangplank, "our agreement." "Our agreement," I shouted back, "says no experiments. Goodbye, Ben, and good luck. Liberty forever, but no lightning rods." So I returned to the vestry, and Ben sailed alone. I didn't want to show you this picture because I didn't want to give away that Amos was left behind when the ship sailed. Now, I want to remind you again of two things. One is, in the back of this book, there is a map which shows Ben Franklin's journeys, and there is a timeline here that you can follow along if you have a copy of the book as to where we are. Here, for instance, in 1741, he invented the Franklin stove. In 1752, he performed a famous kite experiment. In 1757 to 1762, he travels to London. So that's where we are in the timeline. We have another page of things that he is famous for. So bye-bye until next time.